So let's talk about the spine again. And I want to come back to the bony structures in the spine and just point out a few different features of the spine or the vertebra themselves. We talked about the cervical spine and the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine and the different curves of that. But I want you to also notice that each of these vertebrae also have what we call the spinous process, which is this pointy prominence on the back of the vertebra. And this is what you'll palpate on yourself if you were to feel the spine on your back, are these spinous processes of the vertebra here. They also have a transverse process, which is going to be something that you probably won't be able to palpate in most parts of the spine. Here in the lumbar spine, you can see them pointing off to the sides here, these little side projections of the bone. Then on the front of the spine, we can see what we call the body of the vertebra here, which creates this very thick, bulky part of the vertebra, which is much smaller in the cervical spine than the lumbar spine, which makes sense because as we go down lower on the spine, I'm now carrying more weight that my body has to carry. And these are going to be, we'll look at later, but a really important part of those weight-bearing points of the spine. So up here, I only have to carry this around. Down here, I've got to carry all of this around. So all of the weight of the upper body is being carried by these vertebral bodies. And between them, we'll talk about later the discs that sit in between each of these bodies. You can see in between there. Now, the other thing that's important to notice is you can't really see it well with Fred, but you might be able to see in the cervical spine that there's a little metal rod that's going through that's holding him upright, and that's going right through the vertebral foramen. And we'll talk about the spinal cord that goes through there soon. Then the other point here we're going to look at next is what's called the facet joints, which is where each of the vertebrae articulate with the one above and below it. So each vertebra has a pair of facet joints on the upper portion to connect to the vertebra above it, and a pair of facets on the lower portion of the vertebra to connect to the vertebra below it. These facet joints are really important because they give the flexibility of the vertebra to move on top of each other. They're also a weight-bearing point, which we'll kind of look at how that works a little bit more later on. But they also allow for this flexibility as well as stability of the spine, this balance of the two. The facet joints are synovial joints. Remember, we talked about synovial joints as being any of really the more mobile joints of the body. So you can imagine your spine as a pretty mobile part of the body. These little facet joints, right, are going to be synovial joints, meaning that there's going to be a capsule that secretes fluid. There's some cartilage in there, and that fluid allows for that mobility, allows for the bones to glide over top of each other. Now, the next thing that I want you to think about is the spinal cord. So we talked about the vertebral foramen as that hole through the center of the vertebra, or somewhat through the center, which is going to be where the spinal nerve comes through, or the spinal cord with many nerves. In fact, we have millions of nerve fibers going through the spinal cord, carrying messages from the brain and the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system, or the rest of the body, the muscles, the skin, the organs, telling the body how to function. So that vertebral foramen is like a hollow tube that goes all the way down that allows for the passage of the spinal cord, which is really important because, as you can imagine, the spinal cord, because it is full of nerves, is going to be a sensitive part of the body. So it needs not only that stability and protection, but we also know that the spine needs to move. So by having several vertebral levels, we allow for this mobility, but we also have this strong bony structure that's protecting and supporting this more vulnerable part of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves that are going within that vertebral foramen. So within the spinal cord itself, we also see this protective layer around it, which we call the dura mater, which creates a watertight membranous sac around it to hold this fluid around the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is going to go all the way down to about L1, L2, and then it turns into kind of just these free-floating nerves, which was often called, compared to a horse's tail, the cauda equina, which is going to be that kind of end of the spinal cord where they become nerves that will go and innervate those last segments. Now within each one of these, so we have the spinal cord itself that's going to go down most of the way, as we mentioned, but at each layer between each vertebra we're going to have a pair of spinal nerves that are kind of leave the spinal cord to go out to communicate with the periphery of the body. So we've got 31 pairs of those, meaning we've got 8 in the cervical, so we've got, remember, above and below each level. We've got 12 in the thoracic, 5 in the lumbar. We've got 5 sacral nerve levels, you can see with these holes here in his sacrum, and 1 coccygeal. So we've got 31 pairs of these nerves that are going to go out and innervate and communicate with the rest of the body. As you can imagine, nerves are going to be somewhat vulnerable, sensitive structures, things that we want to keep well protected, but are also going to be very valuable to this communication system of the body, to be able to not only control function, but also motor function, but also sensory function of the body. So we have a small little opening between each one of the vertebrae here for each of those spinal nerves, and you can probably see it better in your manual there. You can see the view, if you look in your manual next to the spinal nerves, it's going to show a cross section where you're looking down on the vertebra, and you can see more clearly how the spinal nerves come out through the sides of the vertebra there to allow them to communicate with the periphery. So we have these really important functions, and we're not going to talk a lot about the nervous system, but clearly we could go into a lot of depth on how the nervous system works and how it communicates. But what we see is mostly we've got the motor nerve innervation moving from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system to tell the muscles and the organs what to do, and the sensory communication creating this awareness of what's happening, this perception of what's happening in the body, and bringing that information back to the brain. So it allows us both to perceive pain and as well as to adapt to it, as well as to be able to make coordinated movements in that motor control of the body. And this is really important. We tend to think of pain as a bad thing, but our perception of pain is a really important sensation that allows us to be conscious of and alter our actions and our movements so that we don't do things like leave our hand on a hot stove and lose fingers and appendages. That this pain perception is really important. However, that pain perception can get altered at many different points along the nerve, which might be closer to the spine, it might be closer to the problematic tissue, wherever that might be, and it might even potentially be happening in the brain itself. So when we look at pain, it's a much more complex topic, but just understanding kind of how the nerves go in a general sense is really helpful. So the nerves connect to very specific parts of the body, which again is a very complex system if we look at the nerves in particular, but there are some kind of generalizations that we can look at that can be helpful. The cervical spine here is going to innervate the upper chest and the arms here. In fact, C5 to T1 is going to be the brachial plexus, which innervates the whole arm. So we've got the innervation of the neck, the upper chest, and the arms coming from the cervical spine. The thoracic spine is going to innervate the chest and the abdomen, meaning as well, in addition to that, the abdominal organs and the thoracic organs here. So the thoracic spine is going to be a really important part of not only the sensory awareness of the torso, but also the functioning of the organs in the abdomen and in the chest cavity. The lumbar spine is going to innervate the legs, the pelvis, and the bowel and the bladder. So the rest of the organs will be coming from the thoracic spine. So you can imagine that damage to any part of that will influence everything below it potentially. If we have a spinal injury, if we have a nerve injury just at one segment, potentially just irritating that one segment. And you can find charts of the specifics of that if you're interested. But for our purposes, just getting a big picture awareness of how this works is really important. So you can imagine that damage to the nerves themselves will create potentially pain, could create numbness, could create tingling, could create radiating pain, this kind of electric pain, what we kind of think of as nervy pain, which is more of that sharp electric shooting pain potentially. And really, I think it's a good point to notice that any time you have a student who has nerve pain, numbness, sharp pain, radiating pain, tingling, that it is helpful to make sure that they're being seen by another healthcare professional, that nerve pain can be a more significant problem. And it's always important as a yoga teacher, I think, to err on the cautious side. So there's the short and sweet of the breakdown of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and the facet joints. We'll come back and talk about the discs when you're ready.